Welcome everyone to this special occasion, welcoming Arnie Gottlieb, candidate for State's Attorney. This evening is important in many ways, and we wish, of course, for higher attendance, and we probably would have had higher attendance, honestly, if we had two candidates. Every effort was made, it should be pointed out, to get two candidates. Ultimately, negotiations with the Martha's campaign yielded no results. We did what we could to provide assurances that this would be a productive and non-partisan affair, which it most definitely would have been. Briefly, like many people, I was not tuned to the importance of the state's attorney position until recent awakening of civic responsibility about 2 years ago. And the more we learn about challenges we face in this country and in this area, in terms of mass incarceration, in terms of the opioid crisis, in terms of racial justice, we see how nationwide the position of prosecutor controls so much of what is done in the justice system. In Vermont, we call our prosecutors county state's attorneys. In this race, again, is between Erica Marthage and Arnie Gottlieb. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce candidate for state's attorney, Attorney Arnie Gottlieb.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. A little smaller crowd, so I guess it'll be a little warmer and fuzzier. We'll be a little chattier, maybe is a better way to say it, rather than any kind of formal presentation. This is probably, well, I'm sure this is probably the last public speech before the election next Tuesday. A little nostalgic about it. I've been all over the county. And what I tell folks is that this really is the most important election, I think, that Bennington County has seen in quite some time. You could not have two more diametrically opposed candidates with diametrically opposed ideas in the running. I liken it to what we currently have, which I would call decades-old 1980s filed charges, send to prison, filed charges, send to prison, with what I would like to see, which is moving the office into the 21st century, which is a shift in attitude, in culture, that recognizes what is actually going on in the community. It's obvious, maybe it's not obvious, but I will tell you, I'm not a politician. I don't claim to be a politician. I never was a politician, nor do I want to be a politician. This is not in any way a career choice, especially at my age, I guess. But I threw my hat into the ring because it was important. I personally have 35 plus years experience in the criminal defense field. I've seen a lot of things, everything from minor misdemeanors to capital murder cases where the state wants to take the life of my client. And that's pretty heavy stuff. So I think I come to this with enough experience in having dealt with prosecutors on so many different levels, the federal level, the state level, county level, and municipal level. So I think I know how cases should be presented. I think I have a very good understanding of the system. And so with that, I threw my hat into the ring because there are a number of things, which we'll go into in a moment, that I thought needed to change. And it's been a very eye-opening experience the past few months. I think I have visited almost every town in Bennington County. I have knocked on hundreds of doors. I've discovered new neighborhoods and cul-de-sacs I didn't know existed. I've lost 6 pounds, by the way. But the best thing is I've met a lot of people, a lot of interesting people who come to the door who really don't know who I am, who don't know what the state's attorney does, and they've been very good conversations, and that's probably been the highlight of the whole process. And of course they always ask, so why are you running? And I go through the process of telling them how I've been a criminal defense lawyer all my life, which I consider to be very noble and good work. People need representation when the powers that be in the system want them for various reasons. So it's that Don Quixote, protect them. But at some point in time, you learn and realize that if you want to change the system, if you really want to change how criminal justice is administered, then the state's attorney's office truly is the best way to do it. And I say that because when you think about it, the state's attorney's office has more discretionary power than anyone in the system. Let me say that again. They have more discretionary power than anybody else in the system. They decide who's going to be charged, what the charges are, how many charges will there be. They decide what recommendations they're going to give to a court on the issue of bail. They decide who might be eligible for some sort of diversion or alternative treatment. They decide who's going to get what kind of plea deal. And they decide what kind of recommendation they're going to give to a court regarding sentencing at the end of a case. So when you consider all of that discretionary power, you think, wow, this really is the place to change the system. And so that is why I decided to throw my hat in the ring. And when I started out, there were really a couple of issues that I thought needed to be presented as I observed them. The first one was a drug court, and the second one dealt with the incarceration rate in Bennington County. And it kind of evolved as I knocked on doors and spoke with people. But as it relates to a drug court, folks that I spoke to, there is an overwhelming desire and belief system that there is an overwhelming need for a drug court. There is an opiate issue that is not being addressed. As many of you know, there was an organizational meeting back in February where folks who were concerned wanted to establish a drug court. There were law enforcement representatives, there were legislators, there were treatment folks, and the person who was conspicuously absent was the state's attorney. And so when you realize, as I just indicated, the discretionary power and the involvement of the state's attorney, I find that reprehensible, that the state's attorney would not be present for that type of a meeting. And when the news media tried to find her afterwards, she was not available for a comment. So she has no interest, and if there is no interest from the state's attorney's office, it's just not going to happen. And I can assure you that I have an interest because I do believe it's important. Because as it relates to drugs, you just cannot brush it with a broad stroke. Drug issues are complex and have a number of nuances below the surface. An example I like to give is a simple drug possession. If an officer stops a car and finds that there is a large quantity of drugs and they are packaged for sale, it's very clear what those folks in the car were up to. Okay? They're drug dealers most likely. And those are the folks that need to be dealt with the harshest, punished, and sent to prison. There's just no ifs, ands, and buts about it. But most drug stops are not that clear cut. It's usually some teenager, 20-something, young kid, I guess older too, who gets stopped for a violation and there's something that they shouldn't have in their pocket. So then the question becomes, why is it there? Is there an addiction issue, which ought to be handled one way? Or is it just a stupid decision by someone, which ought to be handled another way? One may require a treatment regimen, and one may require a diversion educational component to say, hey, wise guy, this is just not smart, knock it off. And the other person, of course, has a real issue. So there are just so many nuances under the surface that I think a state's attorney needs to address and look under the surface. And that's the beauty of a drug court, because a drug court can be actively involved in these folks coming back month after month to say, hey, how you doing? And if you hang something over their head, 9 times out of 10, they're going to do what needs to be done. Because if they know if they do it, their case may be dismissed, they can move on, they get their issues addressed, and they don't have a criminal record. So it's quite a nice option. And the way it is now, only the state's attorney is currently deciding who might get referred to a diversion program. It's being cherry-picked on the folks that the current state's attorney believes ought to do it. In a traditional drug court setting, there are a number of people that can refer folks for treatment. The state's attorney, defense counsel, a judge, and law enforcement, if they believe it necessary. So it's all inclusive. It's not the sole power of the state's attorney who doesn't want to give up that power. It's a little more democratic, and I think it works better. So the old ways just don't work. I think they've been tried. And I've mentioned somebody here before. Getting tough on drug folks hasn't worked in the past. The 1980s had the cocaine crisis, and the legislative responses there was to get tough. 3 strikes, you're out. Maximum sentences, fill up the prisons. And where are we today? We've got prisons that are bulging at the seams, and I don't think we've addressed the underlying drug issues. So, and it's costing us a fortune. If you're a fiscal conservative, and I tend to be one myself, if you can take a fraction of that money that we spend on warehousing folks and move it to any of the programs that we just discussed to get at the underlying issues, how much better off would we be? And it would be so much cheaper. Statistics from the National Association of Drug Court Professionals and the Government Accountability Office say that drug courts reduce crime, save money, and cut on recidivism. So to me, it just seems like a no-brainer, and hence that's why I think a drug court would be important. The second issue I've been talking about while walking around the campaign trail is the prison population. Surveys show that most people believe that criminal justice reform is necessary. And of those, about 89% say the one thing that deserves the most attention is the rate in which we incarcerate folks. And Vermont does not get a free pass here. Vermont is in the same boat. We have doubled the prison population since the 1990s, and there has not been a crime rate that has been doubled to be commensurate with that. Out-of-state prisons are holding folks. We're sending folks to Pennsylvania, to Mississippi, and they're private prisons where it's a profit motive, so it's very clear if you're a private company doing that. Obviously, you want to make money, so you get as many people in there you can. You cut the services. I mean, it's capitalism, maybe at its worst. I don't know. And there's still a proposal in the state legislature right now for a 900-plus bed facility. And to me, it's ludicrous. And the folks that are being held, many of them are waiting trial. I like to carry around one of my favorite visual aids is the last, what we call jury draw in Bennington County. It's a list on the first Tuesday of every month of all the folks that want to go, their cases are ready to go to trial. And the last one was about 6 pages long and had 70-some people on it. Now, you tell me how, in a small county that has maybe 3 or 4 trial dates per month, how in the world they're going to try all those cases. And so, people come back month after month to see if their cases are going to be drawn for a jury trial, which means there's transportation expenses, which means, you know, there's more expense on both sides, both prosecution and defense, in pursuing the cases. Families, victims, and witnesses don't get closure because they have to keep coming back. It's just a terrible system. And so my answer to that is to move the cases along quicker and try to resolve them. That would get rid of some of the folks. And I'm talking about some of the low-hanging fruit, I think, that we could get out of the prison system. That's one way. The other is to allow folks who are waiting trial to be out without having to post some high bond. I think bonds in this county are quite high. The only real reason you hold somebody prior to trial is because either you think they're a danger to the community, or you think they're going to flee, that they won't show up when they're supposed to. That's the criteria on whether you hold somebody prior to trial. And folks that are not dangerous and you think are going to show up, they don't need to be held. Or if you feel there's some risk, put an ankle monitor on them or have tight conditions. There are ways to fix the problem in the prison population. Those are the short-term ones. The bigger ones, of course, with the institution of a drug court or getting the legislature to reallocate funds from a high prison budget to, as we discussed before, more alternative treatment options, that would be a longer-term way to lower the prison population. The final topic I want to talk about, and then we can open it up, is what I call a focus on serious charges and file only the cases that you can prove. Let me tell you how this particular issue came about. There was something I had thought about but really had not focused much on until I started knocking on some doors. And I was surprised that consistently folks were saying, gosh, you know, we know people or we have family members that this state's attorney's overcharging. I mean, she's piling on charges like crazy, and they're serious charges and just using it for leverage. And I heard it quite a bit. And being an attorney for 35 years, sometimes you take that with a bit of skepticism, because sometimes I can't believe what my clients tell me. You know, they have an agenda sometimes, and so, okay. But I decided, you know what, maybe it's worth looking into. And so what our campaign did is we thought, okay, what's the most serious charges that a state's attorney can file? And of course, it was an easy one, homicides, where somebody loses a life. And the homicides in the statutes are murder, attempted murder, and manslaughter. So we filed a Freedom of Information request with the county clerk in Bennington and said, give us these files. We know there weren't a lot of them, but enough that we could at least take a look at them. And if you did other things like burglaries and rapes, you'd probably get much more. But we were trying to just focus just to get an idea, because this was an exploratory venture, really. So what happened was we got back that their computer system looked back, and they had on their computer 3 years worth of homicide charges. And if you look at that chart, you'll see in the last 3 years there were 10 homicide cases filed in Bennington County. 3 of them are still pending, and the other 7 have been completed. They've been resolved by either pleading to less serious charges or altogether dismissed. And in looking at that, I mean, it didn't seem right to me. I'm thinking, why are all these very serious cases being dismissed? And to me, there's only a couple of answers. Either the cases were overcharged to begin with, for whatever reason, either knowingly or unknowingly, for use of leverage or not knowing the law. I don't know, and there's probably only one person who really knows. But it concerned me because if they're intentionally filed overcharged, that's an ethical issue. There are ethics that attorneys have in the Code of Professional Responsibility that you don't assert something in a legal matter if you don't believe it's provable. So I hope that they weren't filed intentionally for purposes of leverage, because again, that would be improper. So then the other question becomes, okay, if we assume for the moment that those cases are legitimate and the state's attorney thought that they are provable and should be filed, then the next question is, so what happened to them? Where'd they go? Why weren't they prosecuted to the full extent of the law? It's a serious crime, very serious crime. Somebody either lost or almost lost a life. So why are they all being dismissed or pled to lesser charges? And again, I do not know the answer. There's probably only one or two people who really know the answer to that question, but it's wrong. If you can't prove the case to begin with, don't file it. Or if you're not up to pursuing it the way you should, then somebody else needs to pursue it. So that became an issue that I was not aware of. Basically about the last month. I never thought that that was going to be an issue of the campaign. And I think it's a serious one because my guess is, and it's purely a guess, that if I went through other charges, other serious charges, I have a feeling I would find some similar kinds of statistics. And I will tell you that I knocked on one door of a woman in Bennington, and she was the one probably who convinced me the most that this was happening. And it had to do with her son who was involved in a domestic dispute with a girlfriend. They got into a fight. There was a physical assault, and he wouldn't let this young lady out of his room. And so the state's attorney, in addition to all the assault type charges, filed a kidnapping charge, saying detaining this person for not letting her get away. It seemed to be an overcharge. And the bottom line is I did look at that specific case, and that kidnapping case was dismissed because the person pled to what I think was probably the appropriate charge to begin with. So I think it's a history. I wish I had an opponent to talk about it. And I think we all know the issue that's been bandied about for the last month or two about debates and forums and being part of the democratic process so that voters can compare the candidates side by side, but my opponent won't do it. She's had 4 or 5, I've lost count already, opportunities to get on a stage with me to talk about the issues, and she won't do it. She will do it separately, but not together. There were a couple other articles over the past couple months, and 7 Days and Vermont Digger, where reporters interviewed me and talked to other folks on issues. Attempts to reach my opponent went unresponsive. She's in hiding. I mean, I don't know what else to say. We have a missing state's attorney. And I wish the voters deserve it. The voters truly deserve a side-by-side, whether you call it a debate or a forum. I mean, obviously, Jonathan indicated that she refused this forum. I don't know what in the world could be prejudicial about this. Each side says what they want to say and takes questions. It's not like a debate where questions are formulated by somebody and thrown out there. So it's a very different environment, but it is what it is. So Anyway, I guess with that being said, we're at the end of the primary season anyway. I want to thank Jonathan for putting this together. I know, along with MoveON Manchester, I appreciate all the effort and the scheduling issues that you were first presented with when you came up with this idea. I know it was difficult and frustrating, and getting commitments on who would show and who wouldn't. But it's been a pleasure speaking to you folks, as well as everybody I've spoken to during the course of the past 3 months. I think we really do have an opportunity to make some big changes in this county. How criminal justice reform is to be administered. And it's an opportunity that does not come along very often, because I don't know that there's many people that step up to the plate to do it. And it's not just Bennington County, by the way. I mean, I've seen so many prosecutors who basically run unopposed year after year after year. And as some literature I've read by the ACLU, it's the most important person you've never heard of. And it's very true when you think about, again, about the discretionary power that these folks have. It's important. So I ask for your vote next Tuesday in the first step of what I consider to be a very important election. And I can assure you that I will do my best to make the changes that I think the folks in Bennington County would like to see being made. Thank you.
Anyone have any questions you'd like to pass along?
I'm thinking about medical cannabis and your feeling about what you might do in terms of promoting a cannabis economy versus ending the drug war.
Yeah. Some people think it's ironic that on one hand, the state is legalizing cannabis for private use, and on the other hand, there is a so-called drug crisis. Well, I think it is the wave of the few. I mean, states after states are legalizing it. I view it much like alcohol, if used appropriately, if monitored appropriately by the state, if, I suppose, taxing and regulation is all part of the equation. I don't see an issue with it. I mean, the state's attorney does not legislate. They can weigh in on things, but essentially the state's attorney administers whatever the legislature passes. So if the legislature determines that possession of an ounce of marijuana is no longer a crime, well, the state's attorney doesn't prosecute it. If there's possession more than that, then it's subject to prosecution. So it's really an issue for the state's attorney to follow the law and do what's necessary. I don't know that many, and maybe some do, have stronger positions on what the law should be. I tend to leave that for people that are maybe smarter than I am and really have an understanding of what addiction issues are, and treatment and needle exchanges and all those other things that are being bandied about. I don't pretend to be an expert in the area. I don't know about it. I certainly, in considering prosecution, I certainly would take what I feel to be expert opinions from folks who know what they're talking about in formulating decisions. I hope maybe that answers the question.
I think I have a written question submitted. Your opponent claims she is better qualified because she grew up here and therefore knows the needs of Bennington County more than you. Why is or isn't this so?
Yeah. I remember very distinctly when I first filed my petition to run. I gave a little talk outside the courthouse after filing and spoke about some of these things I just talked about, some of the positions. And the newspaper reporter at the time went to seek a comment from my opponent. And my opponent's comment that I read in the paper, she responded with a statement where she did not challenge my qualifications, or my experience, or my judgment, or my ability. What she challenged is what you just said. I've been here longer, therefore I know what the county residents here in Bennington County want and need. Well, I find that a bit insulting and condescending, to tell you the truth. And not just me. I think any of the folks here or out in the community who come from somewhere else, and a lot do, I think they should be a bit taken back as well. I mean, folks come here for a lot of reasons. They come here to raise kids, or to start careers, or open businesses. They invest in houses. They volunteer on boards and communities and schools. They do a lot of stuff. And to tell them that because they're from somewhere else, and therefore, for instance, shouldn't run for office, again, I think she should be ashamed of herself for that kind of comment. I believe that a good idea is a good idea. And to me, it doesn't matter whether that idea comes from someone who originally came from New York, or from Ohio, or a fifth-generation Vermonter. If it's a good idea, it's a good idea. Case closed. How long you've been here? Irrelevant. So yeah, I guess if that's the only issue you've got to run on, if you think you're on the wrong side of all these substantive issues, maybe she felt that's all it was. But I just think she should be ashamed, to be honest with you. It's just that simple.
Yeah, I agree with what you said. I think it's good to have new blood in every respect. And in this respect, we have a real problem in Vermont. Our criminal system is wacko. Why have we never had a drug court?
Well, I guess you have to ask.
You have to get. I mean, why do you think? Why do you speculate? Why?
In this instance, I think it is a person who does not want to lose control of the process. If you have someone who's a state's attorney and gets to make the decisions on, okay, this person, yeah, I think we'll send you to diversion. I think you can. There's a lot of control there. And I think it's hard to give that up. That's my gut reaction. I think that's my gut. You know, I think she also likes to say that it's a money issue. There may be some of that, but I think there are resources. I mean, a lot of drug courts are funded by grants. You can apply to grants for a lot of places. I'm certain that my opponent never filed an application for money, a grant for anywhere. And the bottom line, you just have to be interested. Like I said, if you don't show up to a community discussion where people want one, it's just not going to happen. Yes?
Is it, I'm just curious, is it the state's attorney the only one who can say, yes, we should have a drug court?
Not the only one, but if she's not on board, I mean, you have to have somebody who's willing to be part of the process. I mean, it's just not a one-person show. Like I said, the state's attorney, defense counsel, judges, law enforcement, if everybody believes it's a good idea, it'll happen. I mean, it may not always be easy, but it's a goal that you can set your sights on. It'll happen if everybody's on board. And maybe there's a selling process that needs to go on as well.
I'm also wondering if, I mean, recently there was an article, I think just a few days ago, I forget where I saw it. You know, I mean, it's talking about bail being the new debtor's prison.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, you referenced this. And
Yeah.
so if we were able to not put, as you would like to do, so many people sitting in prison waiting,
Mm-hmm.
would that make a significant impact on the out-of-state, the Vermont out-of-state prisoners who are sent somewhere else?
I don't know if it would have a big effect, because most of those folks that are out on bail, or waiting for trial, I should say, are usually housed close by. they're at Marble Valley up in Rutland or over in Springfield. So they're, you know, an hour or two drive so they can get back and forth to court. So they're not transporting folks from Pennsylvania or down south. Most of those folks, I think virtually all those folks, are folks that have, their cases are over, they have been sentenced, and they're done. Yeah. Torres.
Are there communities in the state where the state's attorney's performance is particularly appealing or admirable as far as you're concerned?
There's a couple. Sarah George up in Chittenden County, I think, is criminal justice reform minded. Mr. Cahill, I think it's Windham or Windsor, Windham County. They were the first ones, for instance, when the new marijuana law was passed. They got together and fairly much jointly sponsored an expunge your record events. They took the initiative to do it. And so I find that to be progressive criminal justice reform. I mean, it's easy, it's low-hanging fruit, I think. I mean, it should be a no-brainer. There are maybe, I have a slight difference in opinion maybe on how it could have been done. I know locally, and I shouldn't say this because I'm not absolutely certain about how it happened up north, how it was, how the word was disseminated. But locally, after they did it, I wrote a letter to the editor saying it ought to be done here. And the very next day, I saw that our current state's attorney had a little front page ad in front of the banner saying that she and the sheriff are going to have a similar kind of event. You know, come to the library or, you know, come to the state's attorney's office and we'll check your records and we'll see you're eligible. I don't know that that was a fact. I saw the one at the state's attorney's office and there were not hardly any people showing up. I think that if you truly believed in the process, I think it would have been a lot easier and more effective to go into the records. The court has the records. They would probably have the last known address of folks who have been convicted. Okay, maybe it costs money to send a stamped envelope, but you could send them and say, you are now eligible. My guess if you took a proactive approach like that, I bet the response would have been much bigger. Been huge, actually.
Is there anything in Rutland that is particularly
They have a drug court there, but I don't know all the specifics on the mechanics.
That the state's attorney and the teamwork.
Yeah, I think the federal court does a lot of it as well. Yeah, I don't know how that one is structured, I have to admit.
So she's been in office for how long now?
12 years,
12 years.
3 terms. So, you know, my view is, someone who I know, who I believe to be very wise, is fond of saying to me, the best indicator of future behavior is past behavior. So my guess is, yes, I think our current state's attorney is doing some things because she sees the writing on the wall. She feels the pressure and attempting to do some things. My guess is if there would not be any opposition, I don't think there'd be any change.
Are there any points where you agree? I mean, anything?
I'll give her some credit. There was instituted recently in juvenile cases where if a police officer has a delinquency issue and thinks that a diversion or out-of-court process would be of benefit, they have the ability to institute that as well without going through the court process. I think that's good. You know, I'm not going to sit here and rag on everybody. I'm willing to say when something is a good idea, it's a good idea. I think a lot more can be done, but again, I think it's cultural. if you think it's important, you'll find ways to do it. Yes? Great.
Domestic violence is something that's on the minds of a lot of people in this county.
Mm-hmm.
We're not immune from any domestic violence cases being filed in criminal court. How do you view and prosecute those cases differently than the current state's attorney?
That's a good question. Those kinds of cases have a lot of emotion in them. There can be real danger. There of course is pressure on a victim. For the sake of argument, we'll call it a wife, to file charges, to go through the process. And a lot of, having been a defense lawyer myself, I often know that people might not follow up and pursue. And sometimes they're forced to, and maybe they should. They're hard cases. I don't know if you have something in particular you would say, when you say how would it be done different. I have a hunch you're thinking of something in particular that's in mind.
There was a domestic violence court in Bennington County about 2005, which after the presiding judge at the time rotated out of the county, your challenger did not keep the domestic violence court going as an alternative to incarceration.
So let me turn the question back to you. What did you find the advantage to be of a domestic violence court that disappeared when she took office?
I don't do domestic violence cases.
Okay.
But as with a drug court, it is an alternative just to straight incarceration. Domestic violence can arise from different types of problems: mental health, substance abuse, poverty. Some of those issues can be dealt with in the domestic violence court, just the way addiction can be dealt with in the context of the drug court.
Yeah. If the goal is ultimately reunification of the family, then, filing charges, sending folks to prison basically does the opposite, it seems to me. You're punishing, and maybe there's an element of punishment that needs to be meted out, but if your real goal is a reunification and work on the relationship, the same kind of diversion or therapy or whatever is appropriate deemed by experts that know what they're doing, whether it's a counseling setting or whatever it is. And my guess is there's probably a lot of folks who might even be able to have some of that kind of treatment under their own insurance if in fact it's covered. I do know a particular psychologist who, because of things like Obamacare and Affordable Care Act, that a lot more services like that is available for folks that have anger issues, that they can get counseling. And as you whittle it away, then things are not available and not affordable. So, but I agree with your proposition that alternative forms, again, whether it's domestic violence, whether it's alcohol, whether it's drugs, are good options if they work. Anything else? Well, again, thank you very much. Again, I look forward to your vote. Get out there August 14th. Thank you.